The red sun of Kepler 442b was setting behind the mountains when the attack sirens started screaming across New Denver Colony. Captain Jake Morrison grabbed his weapon and ran toward the outer fence, his boots pounding on the metal walkways. Behind him, families rushed toward the safety bunkers, their faces filled with fear. How many this time? Jake shouted into his radio as he reached the defense wall. "At least 6 stalkers, maybe more," came the crackling reply from Sergeant Kim. "Lopez, they're bigger than the last ones, Captain." "Much bigger." Jake looked through his scope and felt his blood turn cold. The nightmare stalkers were moving through the tall grass like shadows, their black bodies nearly invisible in the dim light. Each one stood 12 feet tall, with claws that could cut through steel and teeth like daggers. Their amber eyes glowed. In the darkness, watching the human settlement with deadly intelligence, these creatures had been attacking New Denver for 3 months now. The alien Zorathi who lived on this planet used them as weapons, sending them to drive the human colonists away. No one had ever tamed a stalker. No one had ever made one obey. They were pure killing machines, and they were very good at their job. "Fire when ready," Jake ordered his soldiers. The defense guns opened up, sending bright energy beams toward the approaching monsters. The stalkers dodged and weaved, moving faster than anything that big should be able to move. Some of the shots hit their armored hide, but the creatures barely slowed down. Dr. Lisa Hammond watched the battle from the command center, her hands shaking as she studied the screens. She had been studying these creatures for months, trying to find some weakness, some way to stop them. But the stalkers seemed to learn from every attack, getting smarter and more dangerous each time. "The fence won't hold them," she said quietly. To Commander Ruth Adams, who stood beside her, "They're too smart. They know exactly where our weak spots are." "How long do we have?" Ruth asked. "Maybe 10 minutes before they break through Sector 7, Lisa replied, pointing at the screen. "They always hit the same spot. It's like they're testing us, learning our defenses." Outside, the battle was getting worse. The stalkers had reached the outer fence and were tearing through the metal with their claws. Jake and his soldiers kept firing, but their weapons barely slowed the creatures down. One stalker, bigger than all the rest, stood at the back of the pack. It had scars covering its midnight black hide and eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. "Fall back." "To the inner perimeter," Jake ordered. "Everyone to the bunkers now." The colonists ran through the streets, parents carrying children, everyone trying to reach safety. But in all the chaos and fear, one small boy got separated from his family. 8-year-old Danny Clark had been playing in the community garden when the sirens started. By the time he realized what was happening, the evacuation was already underway. Danny ran toward the main bunker, his short legs carrying him as fast as they could. But he took a wrong turn in the maze of prefab buildings and found himself in a dead-end alley. Behind him, he could hear the sound of metal being torn apart and the shouts of soldiers. He turned to run back the way he came, but stopped when he saw a massive shadow fall across the entrance to the alley. The biggest stalker he had ever seen was standing there, blocking his escape. It was the scarred one from the back of the pack, the one that seemed to be their leader. Danny had never seen a stalker up close before. It was even more terrifying than in the pictures. Its body was covered in thick, armored plates that looked like they could stop a tank shell. Its claws were as long as kitchen knives, and its mouth was full of teeth that could bite through steel. But what scared Danny most were its eyes. They were intelligent eyes, watching him with an interest that made his skin crawl. The creature took a step into the alley, then another. Danny pressed himself against the back wall, knowing there was nowhere to run. The stalker was so big that it had to duck its head to fit between the buildings. It moved slowly, like a cat stalking a mouse, taking its time because it knew its prey was trapped. Danny thought about his parents, Pete and Mary Clark, and wondered if he would ever see them again. He thought about his little sister Katie, who was probably safe in the bunkers by now. He thought about his old dog Max, who had died last year back on Earth. Max had been big and scary looking too, but he had been gentle and kind. The stalker was only a few feet away now. Danny could smell its breath, which was like metal and blood. He could see the scars on its hide, old wounds from battles with other creatures or maybe other humans. The creature lowered its head until it was looking directly at Danny, studying him like he was some kind of puzzle dot. Danny knew he was going to die, but for some reason he wasn't as scared as he thought he would be. Maybe it was because the stalker reminded him of Max. Both were big and powerful, but there was something in this creature's eyes that didn't seem completely wild. It looked almost lonely. The creature opened its mouth, showing rows of deadly teeth. Danny closed his eyes and waited for the end. But instead of attacking, the stalker just stood there, breathing heavily. When Danny opened his eyes again, the creature was tilting its head to one side, like it was confused. That's when Danny remembered what his mother always said to Max when the big dog got too excited or aggressive. It was a simple command, one that every dog owner knew. Danny had no idea if it would work on an alien monster, but he didn't have any other options. He looked up at the massive creature and, in the calmest voice he could manage, said, "Sit." The effect was immediate and shocking. The stalker's eyes went wide, and it took a step back. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at the small boy who had just given it a command. Then, slowly and carefully, the creature lowered its back legs, until it was sitting on the ground like an enormous dog. Danny couldn't believe what had just happened. The most dangerous creature in the galaxy was sitting in front of him like a pet waiting for a treat. The stalker's head was still higher than Danny's, but it no longer seemed threatening. Instead, it looked almost curious. "Good boy, Danny," said softly, the way he used to talk to Max. The stalker's ears, which Danny hadn't even noticed before, twitched at the sound of his voice. The moment was broken by the sound of running footsteps. Danny's father, Pete Clark, came running around the corner with 3 soldiers behind him. They all stopped dead when they saw the scene in the alley. The lead soldier raised his weapon, but Pete put out a hand to stop him. "Don't shoot," Pete whispered. "Don't do anything to upset it." The stalker looked at the new arrivals, but didn't move from its sitting position. It seemed to be waiting for something, though no one knew what. Danny walked slowly toward his father, never taking his eyes off the creature. "It's okay, Dad," Danny said quietly. "He's not going to hurt anyone." Pete carefully picked up his son and backed away from the stalker. The creature watched them go, but made no move to follow. It just sat there in the alley, as if it was waiting for another command that never came. Within minutes, the news of what had happened spread throughout the colony and beyond. For the first time in recorded history, a human had given a command to a nightmare stalker, and the creature had obeyed. The implications were staggering, and the ripple effects would be felt across the entire galaxy. The news traveled faster than light across the galaxy. Within 6 hours of Danny Clark's encounter with the nightmare stalker, every major news network was broadcasting the impossible story. A human child had commanded the most feared creature in known space, and it had obeyed. On the capital world of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Helen Rodriguez was pulled from her sleep by an urgent message. She read the report 3 times before she could believe it. Her hands shook as she reached for her communication device to call Earth. "This changes everything," she whispered to herself as she waited for the connection to go through. Meanwhile, in the war chambers of the Zorathi homeworld, Warlord Kextha smashed his fist against the stone table. The other Zorathi warriors stepped back in fear as their leader's rage filled the room. For 300 years, the nightmare stalkers had been their ultimate weapon. No species had ever controlled them except through the ancient rituals passed down through generations. "Impossible," Kextha growled, his voice like grinding metal. "The humans must have used some kind of mind control device. There's no other explanation." His advisor, a smaller Zorathi named Veltar, approached carefully. "My lord, our spies on the human colony detected no unusual technology." The child appeared to use only his voice. Kextha's eyes burned with fury. "Then the humans have learned our sacred secrets somehow. This is an act of war." Across the galaxy, other alien leaders were having similar discussions. In the crystal spires of the Vegan Collective, Senator Yilmoth called an emergency meeting of the ruling council. The vegans were known for their peaceful ways, but they feared what this development might mean for galactic stability. If humans can control nightmare stalkers, Senator Yilmoth said to the assembled leaders, then the balance of power has shifted dramatically. We must investigate this immediately. The militaristic Kromak Empire had a different reaction. General Taruk saw opportunity where others saw danger. In the battle halls of Kromak Prime, he studied the footage of Danny and the stalker over and over again. If we can learn this technique, he told his officers, we can build an army of stalkers. No force in the galaxy could stand against us. Back on Kepler 442b, Danny Clark was trying to eat his breakfast while dozens of adults stared at him. The colony's mess hall had been turned into a temporary meeting room, and representatives from several alien species had arrived during the night to investigate the incident. I don't understand why everyone is so excited, Danny said to his mother, Mary Clark. I just told him to sit. It's what Mom always said to Max when he got too jumpy. Dr. Lisa Hammond leaned forward across the table. She had been studying the footage of the encounter all night, and she was starting to form a theory that seemed impossible. Danny, she said gently, can you tell me exactly what you were thinking when you saw the stalker? Danny shrugged. He looked scared. Not scary, but scared. Like when Max got lost in the thunderstorm and we found him hiding under the porch. He was big and growling, but his eyes looked sad. Dr. Hammond exchanged glances with her research partner, Dr. Alan Foster, who had arrived on the morning transport from Earth. Dr. Foster was an expert in animal behavior, and he had been studying the footage with growing amazement. The creature's body language, Dr. Foster said quietly to Dr. Hammond. Look at how it positions itself after the command. The head tilt, the ear position, even the way it lowers its body. It's identical to canine submission behavior. But that's impossible, Dr. Hammond replied. Stalkers evolved on a completely different world. There's no way they could share behavioral patterns with Earth animals. But as they watched the footage again, the similarities became harder to ignore. The stalker's response to Danny's command wasn't just obedience. It was recognition, as if the creature had been waiting its whole life for someone to speak to it. In a language it understood. Captain Jake Morrison joined their discussion, his face grim with worry. Whatever this is, we need to understand it fast. I've got reports of Zorathi warships moving toward our system. They're not happy about what happened here. As if summoned by his words, the colony's communication system crackled to life. A holographic image appeared in the center of the mess hall, showing the fierce face of Warlord Kextha. Humans of New Denver, the Zorathi leader snarled. You have stolen our sacred weapon through trickery and forbidden technology. Return the stalker to us immediately or face the consequences. Ambassador Rodriguez's voice came through the communication system from the Galactic Council chambers. Warlord Kextha, the Galactic Council has jurisdiction over all disputed territories. Any aggressive action against the human colony will be considered an act of war. The stalkers belong to the Zorathi, Kextha replied. They have served us for countless generations. This human child has used some form of mind control that violates galactic law. Danny looked up from the cereal bowl, confused by all the angry voices. I didn't use any control thingy, he said. I just asked him to sit nicely. The simplicity of the boy's statement seemed to make the adults even more agitated. Senator Yilmoth's image appeared alongside Warlord Kextha's, her crystalline features, reflecting the lights of her council chamber. The Galactic Council demands a full investigation, she announced. If humans have developed new technology for controlling sentient beings, this must be shared with all member species for the safety of the galaxy. We haven't developed anything, Ambassador Rodriguez protested. This appears to be a natural interaction between a human child and an alien creature. General Tarek's image joined the growing collection of alien leaders on the holographic display. The Kromak Empire requests permission to study this phenomenon. Such a valuable military asset should not be monopolized by any single species. Danny's father, Pete Clark, stood up from the table. He was a simple maintenance worker, not a diplomat or a scientist, but he was tired of seeing his son treated like some kind of weapon. Now you all listen here. Pete said, his voice carrying across the room. My boy didn't do anything wrong. He was just being kind to a scared animal. If you want to study something, maybe you should study why that creature was so ready to trust. A child, Mary Clark nodded, putting her arm around Danny's shoulders. Maybe the question isn't how Danny controlled that stalker. Maybe the question is why nobody else ever tried to be nice to them. Dr. Foster suddenly looked up from his notes, his eyes wide with realization. That's it, he said. That's exactly it. Look at how the Zorithi control their stalkers. They use fear, pain, and dominance. They've been treating these creatures like mindless weapons for so long that everyone forgot they might be intelligent beings capable of forming relationships. Ridiculous, Warlord Kextha snarled. Stalkers are beasts of war. They know only violence and hunger. Then explain what happened yesterday, Dr. Hammond challenged. Explain why the most dangerous creature in the galaxy sat down when an 8-year-old boy asked it to. The holographic display flickered as more alien leaders joined the conversation. Representatives from a dozen different species argued about territorial rights, military applications, and scientific protocols. But through it all, Danny just sat at his table, wishing everyone would stop shouting. Can I go see him again? Danny asked his mother quietly. Mary looked at the crowd of arguing adults and made a decision that would change everything. Yes. Honey, I think that's exactly what we should do. As the galactic leaders continued their debate, the Clark family slipped out of the mess hall and headed toward the outer perimeter where the stalkers still waited. Behind them, the argument grew louder as species that had been allies for centuries began to eye each other with suspicion and fear. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the most profound discoveries come not from laboratories or battlefields, but from the simple wisdom of a child who saw a scared animal and decided to be kind. Danny walked slowly toward the outer fence where the big stalker was waiting. The creature hadn't moved from the spot where Danny had left him the day before. He sat perfectly still, like a giant statue made of black metal and muscle, watching. The colony with those strange amber eyes. Stay back, Captain Jake Morrison warned the crowd of scientists and reporters who had followed the Clark family. We don't know if it's still friendly. But Danny wasn't afraid. He had been thinking about the creature all night, wondering if it was lonely sitting out there by itself. On Earth, their dog Max had always been happiest when he was with the family. Maybe this big alien dog felt the same way. Hi there, big guy, Danny said as he approached the fence. The stalker's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and its head turned to focus on the boy. Did you wait for me all night? Dr. Lisa Hammond was recording everything with her scanner, her hands shaking with excitement. Look at its body language, she whispered to Dr. Alan Foster. The tail movement, the ear position, it's displaying classic greeting behavior. Dr. Foster nodded, equally amazed. 3 decades of studying animal behavior, and I've never seen anything like this. That creature is responding to Danny exactly like a domestic dog would respond to its favorite person. The stalker stood up slowly and walked closer to the fence. Up close, Danny could see that it was even bigger than he remembered. Its shoulders were level with the top of the 8-foot fence, and its claws could probably tear through the metal like paper. But there was something gentle in the way it moved, careful not to make any sudden motions that might scare the humans. Can I pet him? Danny asked Captain Morrison. Absolutely not, Jake replied quickly. Those claws could take your arm off. But Danny was already reaching through the fence. The stalker lowered its massive head until it was level with the boy's hand. Very carefully, Danny touched the creature's forehead. The skin felt warm and surprisingly soft, despite its armored appearance. The stalker closed its eyes and made a sound that no one had ever heard before. It was like a rumble of thunder, but softer and more musical. Dr. Hammond's scanner went crazy trying to analyze the sound. It's purring, she said in amazement. A 12-foot killing machine is purring like a kitten. Mary Clark watched her son interact with the deadly creature, her heart torn between pride and terror. Danny, honey, maybe you should step back a little. He likes it, Mom, Danny said, now scratching behind the stalker's ear. Look how happy. He is. The creature was indeed displaying signs of contentment that seemed impossible for a creature bred for warfare. Its eyes were half closed and its entire body had relaxed. The other stalkers, who had been hiding in the tall grass beyond the fence, began to approach cautiously. "There are more of them," someone in the crowd whispered nervously. "5 more." Stalkers emerged from their hiding places, all smaller than the first, but still terrifyingly large. They watched Danny with curious eyes, keeping their distance but clearly interested in what was happening. Dr. Foster was taking notes as fast as he could write. "This is revolutionary. Look at the pack dynamics. The alpha has established trust with a human, and now the others are following his lead." Danny noticed the other creatures and smiled. "Do you want to introduce me to your friends?" he asked the big stalker, who he had started thinking of as Shadow because of his dark color. Shadow turned to look at his pack, then back at Danny. He made a low huffing sound, and one of the smaller stalkers took a few steps forward. "It's okay," Danny said to the newcomer. "I'm Danny. What's your name?" The second stalker tilted its head at the sound of his voice. This one was lighter in color, with silver markings on its face. Danny decided to call her Silver. Dr. Hammond was practically vibrating with excitement as she analyzed her readings. "The social structure is completely different from what we thought. These aren't mindless killers. They're a family unit with complex relationships and communication patterns." Over the next several hours, Danny continued to interact with the stalker pack. He gave each one a name based on their appearance and personality. There was Silver, the curious female who liked to investigate new things. Patches had distinctive white spots on his chest. Bright Eyes was the youngest, barely bigger than a horse, but still intimidating to everyone except Danny. "They're just like dogs," Danny explained to the watching scientists. "They want to play and be part of a family. Look." He had found a large stick and was playing a modified version of fetch with Shadow. The massive creature would bound after the stick with surprising grace, then bring it back and drop it at Danny's feet. His tail, which no one had noticed before, wagged like a giant whip. Dr. Foster was scribbling notes furiously. The behavioral parallels are undeniable. Despite their fearsome appearance and alien origin, these creatures display the same social needs and bonding patterns as Earth's domesticated canines. But not everyone was pleased with these discoveries. A new holographic transmission crackled to life, showing Warlord Kextha's angry face. "This is blasphemy," the Zorathi leader snarled. "The sacred warriors are not pets to be played with by human children. They are weapons of war, bred for battle and conquest." "Maybe that's the problem," Danny said, looking up from where he was scratching Silver's chin. "Maybe they don't want to be weapons. Maybe they just want to be friends." Kextha's eyes blazed with fury. "Impossible. For 300 years, the Stalkers have served the Zorathi in battle. They know only violence and obedience through strength. Then why do they seem so happy now?" Dr. Hammond challenged. "Look at them. These creatures are displaying joy, curiosity, and affection. When was the last time you saw a Stalker behave like this under Zorathi control?" The silence that followed was telling. In all the centuries of using stalkers as weapons, the Zorathi had never seen them display positive emotions. They had been tools of war, nothing more. Danny's little sister Katie had been watching from a safe distance, but her curiosity finally got the better of her. The 6-year-old girl walked up to the fence where her brother was playing with the alien creatures. "They're really pretty," she said, looking up at Silver with wide eyes. Silver looked down at the small girl and did something that made everyone gasp. The massive predator lay down on her belly, lowering her head until she was at Katie's eye level. Then she gently nudged the girl's hand with her nose. "She wants you to pet her," Danny said with a grin. Katie reached through the fence and touched Silver's snout. The stalker's eyes closed in contentment, and she made the same rumbling purr that Shadow had made earlier. "This changes everything we know about these creatures," Dr. Foster said quietly to Dr. Hammond. "They're not just capable of bonding with humans. They crave it. Look how they respond to the children." Shadow had positioned himself protectively near both Danny and Katie, his massive body forming a barrier between them and any potential threats. The other stalkers had arranged themselves in a loose circle, creating a safe space for the human children to play. "They're protecting them," Captain Morrison observed with amazement. "The most dangerous predators in the galaxy are acting like guard dogs." The implications were staggering. If stalkers were naturally social creatures who had been denied proper bonding for centuries, then everything the galaxy thought it knew about them was wrong. They weren't mindless weapons. They were intelligent beings who had been tortured into violence by isolation and fear. As the day wore on, more alien representatives arrived to witness the impossible sight. Danny and Katie played with creatures that had been the stuff of nightmares, while their parents watched with a mixture of pride and worry. But in the back of everyone's mind was the same question: what would happen when the galaxy's military powers decided they wanted these creatures for themselves? The peace couldn't last forever, and when it ended, the choice would be simple. The stalkers would have to decide between their old masters and their new family. The morning sky was filled with ships. HFY War vessels hung like dark clouds above New Denver Colony, while sleek chromac battle cruisers patrolled the edges of the system. On the ground, alien soldiers from 3 different species stood. In tense groups, all watching the human settlement with suspicious eyes. Danny woke up to find his parents talking in worried whispers by his bedroom window. Through the glass, he could see Shadow and the other stalkers lying peacefully in the grass near the fence. They looked calm, but Danny could tell they were nervous about all the new ships in the sky. "What's happening, Dad?" Danny asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Pete Clark turned from the window, trying to hide his worry behind a smile. "Some important people want to meet you and your friends today, son. We need to be very careful." At breakfast, Captain Morrison explained the situation to the Clark family. "The Galactic Council has agreed to let the HFY test their control methods one more time. If they can make the stalkers obey them again, the creatures will be returned to HFY control, if not ... he shrugged. "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." Danny didn't like the sound of that. What if Shadow doesn't want to go with them? What if he wants to stay here? "That's not how it works," Dr. Hammond said gently. "In galactic law, the stalkers are considered property, not people. They don't get to choose." "That's stupid," Katie said, taking a big bite of her cereal. "Silver is my friend. Friends aren't property." Mary Clark hugged her daughter. "I know, honey. But sometimes grown-ups make rules that don't make sense." Outside, the ceremony was being prepared. Warlord Kextha had arrived with a team of HFY priests and a collection of strange devices that hummed with alien energy. Ambassador Rodriguez stood nearby with representatives from a dozen different species, all come to witness this test that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. "The sacred ritual has never failed," Kextha announced to the assembled crowd. "When the stalkers hear the ancient songs and smell the holy incense, they will remember their true masters." Dr. Foster watched the preparations with growing concern. Those sonic frequencies they're using and those chemical compounds, they're designed to cause pain and fear. No wonder the stalkers have been so violent under HFY control. The HFY priests began setting up their equipment in a circle around the area where Shadow and his pack waited. The stalkers seemed to recognize the devices, and their behavior changed immediately. They went from relaxed and peaceful to tense and alert, their ears flattened against their heads. "They're scared," Danny said, pressing against the fence. "Shadow, it's okay, I'm here." The big stalker looked at Danny, and some of the tension left his posture. But he couldn't take his eyes off the HFY equipment, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "Begin the ceremony," Kextha commanded. The priests activated their devices, and immediately the air filled with a high-pitched whining sound that made every human cover their ears. The stalkers reacted much worse. They threw back their heads and howled in pain, their bodies twisting as the sonic waves hit them. "Stop it!" Danny shouted. "You're hurting them!" But the HFY continued the ritual. They began chanting in their ancient language while releasing clouds of bitter-smelling smoke. The stalkers' howls turned to roars of rage and confusion. Shadow's eyes, which had been gentle and intelligent, turned wild and violent. "It's working," Kextha said with satisfaction. "They remember who they serve." The change in the stalkers was terrifying. Minutes ago, they had been peaceful creatures playing with human children. Now they looked like the monsters from every nightmare story. Shadow bared his teeth and slashed at the air with his claws, his mind lost in a haze of pain and artificial. "Rage! Kneel before your masters," the Zorathi priest commanded, raising his staff high. For a moment it seemed like the ritual would work. The stalkers stopped their howling and looked toward the Zorathi with expressions of confused obedience. Even Shadow seemed ready to submit to the old ways, but then he heard something that cut through the pain and chemicals and ancient programming. A small voice, calm and gentle, speaking words that had nothing to do with dominance or fear. "Shadow," Danny called softly. "It's okay, boy. I'm here. You don't have to be scared." The big stalker's head snapped toward the sound of Danny's voice. For a moment he seemed torn between two worlds. The Zorathi ritual pulled at him with centuries of conditioning, demanding obedience through pain. But Danny's voice offered something different. It offered choice. "You're safe," Danny continued, his young voice somehow carrying over the alien chanting. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. Just come to me." Shadow took a step toward Danny, then stopped. The Zorathi devices were still active, still flooding his mind with commands to submit and obey. The other stalkers were already beginning to bow to their former masters. "The ritual is succeeding," Kextha announced triumphantly. "The sacred warriors remember their place." But Dr. Hammond was watching her instruments and frowning. "The neural patterns are all wrong," she said to Dr. Foster. "The stalkers aren't choosing to obey. They're being forced into it. Look at their stress levels." Indeed, the creatures looked miserable. Their bodies were rigid with tension, and their eyes showed nothing but pain and confusion. This wasn't obedience. It was torture. Danny saw it too. His new friends were suffering, and there was nothing he could do to help them while the Zorathi devices were active. Tears ran down his face as he watched Shadow struggling against the artificial commands flooding his mind. "Please stop," Danny begged the Zorathi priests. "You're hurting them." "Pain teaches obedience," Kextha replied coldly. "This is how it has always been done." That's when Katie did something that surprised everyone. The 6-year-old girl ducked under the security rope and ran toward the circle of Zorathi equipment. Before anyone could stop her, she had reached one of the sonic generators and kicked it as hard as she could. The device toppled over and went silent. Immediately, one section of the ritual circle failed, and the stalkers in that area stopped their pained howling. Silver, who had been closest to Katie's sabotage device, shook her head as if waking from a bad dream. "Stop her!" Kextha shouted, but it was too late. Katie was already running to the next device, and this time Danny followed her. Together, the two children began destroying the Zorathi equipment, turning off the painful sounds and poisonous smells that had been torturing their friends. "This is an outrage," Kextha roared. "Guards, stop those children!" But as each device failed, more stalkers broke free from the artificial control. And freed from pain and fear, they remembered who had been kind to them. They remembered the human children who had offered friendship instead of domination. Shadow reached Danny just as the Zorathi soldier was about to grab the boy. The massive stalker placed himself between Danny and the soldier, his protective instincts fully awakened, but he didn't attack. Instead, he simply stood there, a 12-foot wall of muscle and armor, making it clear that anyone who wanted to hurt Danny would have to go through him first, one by one. The other stalkers made the same choice. They positioned themselves around Danny and Katie, forming a protective circle around the children who had shown them kindness. They faced their former masters not with the blind obedience of weapons, but with the fierce loyalty of friends defending their family. "Impossible," Kextha whispered, staring at the scene before him. "They choose the humans over us?" Ambassador Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I think they're choosing freedom over slavery, Warlord, and friendship over fear." The test was over, and everyone knew what the results meant. For the first time in galactic history, a group of sentient beings had been given the choice between their traditional masters and a new way of life, and they had chosen the path of love over the path of pain. The question now was whether the galaxy would accept their choice, or whether this moment of peace would be the last calm before a storm that could tear the known worlds apart. 3 months after the failed Zorothy ritual, Danny Clark was teaching Shadow how to play a new game. The massive stalker was learning to be gentle with a rubber ball, using just the tips of his claws to bat it back and forth with the 8-year-old boy. Nearby, Katie was braiding flowers into Silver's mane while the female stalker purred contentedly. The scene would have been impossible to imagine just a few months ago. Where once there had been fear and violence, now there was laughter and friendship. But the path to this peaceful moment had not been easy. After the stalkers chose to protect Danny and Katie instead of obeying their former masters, the galaxy had erupted in debate. Some species supported the creatures' right to choose their own destiny. Others, led by the Zorathi and Chromac empires, demanded that the weapons be returned to military control. The Galactic Council had spent weeks arguing about the legal status of the stalkers. Were they property or people? Could a species bred for war choose to live in peace? Ambassador Rodriguez had fought tirelessly for the creatures' rights, presenting evidence that they were intelligent beings, capable of making their own decisions. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Hammond and Dr. Foster published their research. Their study proved that stalkers possessed the same brain structures responsible for empathy and social bonding as many recognized sentient species. More importantly, they showed that the creatures had been suffering from what humans would call trauma caused by centuries of forced conditioning and isolation. The evidence is clear, Dr. Foster had testified before the council. These beings have been psychologically damaged by their treatment as weapons. When given the chance to form natural social bonds, they display remarkable intelligence, compassion, and even joy. The turning point came when the council allowed Danny to address them directly. The 9-year-old boy had spoken via hologram to representatives from across the galaxy, with Shadow sitting calmly beside him. "Shadow isn't a weapon," Danny had said in his simple, honest way. "He's my friend. He protects me because he wants to, not because someone made him. Isn't that what friendship is about? Choosing to care about someone?" The boy's words had resonated throughout the galaxy. Within days, peaceful protests erupted on dozens of worlds, with citizens demanding rights for the stalkers. The movement gained momentum when other species began sharing their own stories of creatures they had mistreated or misunderstood. Warlord Kextha had made one final attempt to reclaim the stalkers by force. Zorathy ships had surrounded Kepler 442b, demanding the return of their property. But when they transmitted their traditional control signals toward the planet, something unexpected happened. The stalkers didn't respond with obedience or even defiance. Instead, they gathered around Danny and Katie, forming a protective circle around the children. Shadow had looked directly into the transmission camera and made a sound that Dr. Hammond's equipment translated as roughly equivalent to "No." It was the first time in galactic history that a nightmare stalker had spoken directly to its former masters. And what it said was a simple, clear rejection of everything the Zorathi represented, the image of the massive predator saying no, while protecting human children had spread across every news network in the galaxy. Public opinion shifted decisively in favor of the stalkers' freedom, and the Galactic Council had finally voted to grant them full rights as sentient beings. But the real changes had happened quietly, in the small moments between Danny and his unusual friends. The boy had established routines that gave the stalkers structure without the fear and pain of their old lives. Each morning, they would gather near the colony fence for what Danny called pack time, where they would simply spend time together, playing games or just enjoying each other's company. Shadow had become something like a big brother to Danny, always watching over him and making sure he was safe. The massive creature had learned to moderate his strength so carefully that he could play tug-of-war with a human child without causing harm. He had even learned to speak, using a series of rumbles and purrs that Danny had taught him, Creating a simple but effective communication system, Silver had bonded just as strongly with Katie, becoming the little girl's constant companion and protector. The female stalkers seemed to understand that human children were fragile, and she moved with incredible grace and care whenever the kids were around. The other stalkers had found their own roles within their expanded pack. Patches had become the colony's unofficial guard, patrolling the perimeter not as a weapon but as a friend watching out for his new family. Bright Eyes, the youngest of the group, had appointed himself as playmate to all the colony's children, teaching them games that only a creature with his size and strength could play. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the stalkers themselves. Free from the constant stress and pain of their old lives, they had begun to display behaviors that amazed the scientists studying them. They showed creativity, solving problems in new ways, and even creating what could only be called art by arranging stones and flowers in complex patterns. Dr. Hammond had documented over 200 new behaviors in the months since the stalkers gained their freedom. They're not just intelligent, she told a gathering of xenobiologists from across the galaxy. They're developing their own culture, their own ways of expressing themselves. We're witnessing the birth of a new civilization. The success on Kepler 442b had inspired similar projects throughout the galaxy. Other species began re-examining their relationships with creatures they had considered mere animals or weapons. The Vegan Collective established the first Interspecies Communication Institute, dedicated to finding peaceful ways for different forms of life to coexist. Even some members of the Zorathi and Chromac empires began to question their old ways. A small but growing movement within Zorathi society called for an end to the warrior culture that had defined them for millennia. If even our greatest weapons can choose peace, one Zorathi philosopher had written, perhaps it is time for us to make the same choice. Danny was unaware of most of these galactic changes. For him, the most important thing was that his friends were happy. He had learned to read their moods and needs, understanding when Shadow wanted to play and when he needed quiet time. He had discovered that Silver loved music, especially the lullabies that Katie sang to her in the evenings. As the red sun of Kepler 442b began to set on this particular day, Danny was finishing his homework while Shadow lay beside him occasionally, offering what seemed like helpful suggestions through his rumbling communications. Katie was teaching Silver and the other stalkers a clapping game that they performed with remarkable coordination despite their large claws. Pete and Mary Clark watched their children from the porch of their home, still amazed by how normal this impossible situation had become. Their son had not only befriended the most feared creatures in the galaxy, but had helped them discover their own capacity for love and joy. "Do you think they understand what they've done?" Mary asked her husband. Watching Danny scratch behind Shadow's massive ear, Pete smiled as he watched his boy trying to teach Bright Eyes how to be gentle with a flower. "I don't think Danny sees it as anything special. For him, he just made some new friends." But sometimes the most important changes start with the simplest acts of kindness. As night fell over the colony, the stalkers arranged themselves in a protective circle around the human settlement, not as guards or weapons, but as family members watching over their loved ones. And in the center of it all, 2 human children slept peacefully, dreaming dreams that were now shared by friends who had once been monsters. The galaxy had learned that even the most fearsome predator could choose love over violence, friendship over fear. And it had all started with a little boy who looked at a scared creature and simply said,